15 people ambushed me on my own front lawn, demanding I let my mother and stepfather continue destroying my dead father's $20,000 handcrafted legacy. Inside a house that I legally own and they've been illegally occupying for 8 months. The pastor from my childhood church led the charge, flanked by neighbors, relatives, and even my old high school guidance counselor. They spoke in rehearsed tones about forgiveness, family unity, and how a good son wouldn't let his mother be humiliated over property. Behind them, my stepfather stood with his arms crossed, smirking, fully aware that while they shamed me, his kids had already ripped out the custom woodwork my father spent 20 years building by hand. The part that made my stomach drop wasn't the pressure, it was my mother's silence. This was the same woman who'd promised my father on his hospital bed that his house would be preserved exactly as he left it. Now she stood there while strangers defended the people actively dismantling his life's work, calling me heartless for trying to stop it. They thought this was about emotion, about sympathy, about choosing peace over paperwork. What none of them knew was that my father had planned for this. Every legal document was already in place. The deed, the will, the family security protocol, even the private letters he wrote me about protecting the spirit of the house. Letters meant for moments exactly like this. This wasn't a family argument anymore. It was a public test of whether legacy matters more than convenience, and whether doing the right thing still means anything when guilt is louder than law. By the time they left my lawn, they would understand one thing clearly: evicting people from your own house isn't cruelty, it's preservation. And my father's work would be restored exactly as he intended, no matter how many living people demanded I let it be destroyed. My father wasn't just a homeowner, he was an artist who happened to work in wood and stone. Over 20 years, he'd transformed our house from a basic suburban build into something that belonged in an architecture magazine. Hand-carved crown molding that took him 3 summers to complete. Built-in bookshelves fitted so precisely they looked like they'd grown out of the walls. A kitchen island he designed and built himself, complete with hidden drawers and custom lighting that only turned on when you needed it. He didn't renovate rooms, he composed them. The dining room had a bay window seat with concealed storage for my childhood books. The master bathroom featured a vanity made from reclaimed oak he'd salvaged and restored over an entire winter. Even the basement workshop, his sanctuary, was organized with the kind of care that comes from someone who expects his work to outlive him. Every corner of that house carried intention, and every intention carried his love for us. When Dad died, Mom held herself together for exactly 4 months before she started dating again. I understood the loneliness. Watching your spouse fight cancer for 2 years rewires something inside you. But what I didn't expect was how quickly she would start treating grief like clutter, something to be cleared out so life could move forward. She met Richard at a support group for widows and widowers. Recently divorced, 2 teenage kids, eager for a fresh start. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within 8, he and his children had moved into our house. The timeline felt aggressive, but Mom looked lighter than she had since Dad's diagnosis. I told myself this was healing, that she deserved happiness after 25 years of marriage ended by a hospital room. That was the first lie I told myself. The second came when Mom started calling Dad's workshop wasted space. Richard didn't see craftsmanship, he saw inefficiency. The built-in shelves were dust collectors. The hand-carved molding was dated. The kitchen island Dad had poured months into was impractical for modern living. His kids treated the house like a temporary rental, scuffing custom hardwood floors Dad had installed piece by piece, dumping sports gear over hand tools he'd maintained like surgical instruments. Richard talked constantly about bringing the house into the 21st century, about renovations that would maximize potential. He spoke like someone improving an asset, not inheriting a legacy. What none of them seemed to realize was that my father had never built that house casually. He built it deliberately, and he made sure it would be protected just as deliberately. They saw a house that needed fixing. I saw a legacy being dismantled, exactly the scenario my father had warned me about. I discovered the destruction on a Tuesday morning when I stopped by to pick up some of Dad's tools from the workshop. I'd been giving Mom and Richard space to settle in, checking in maybe once a week to see how they were adjusting. The first thing I noticed was the dining room. The bay window seat, the one Dad had built with hidden compartments for my childhood books, was gone. Ripped out and replaced with a generic bench from some furniture store, the reclaimed oak vanity in the master bathroom had been swapped for a modern double sink that looked like it belonged in a hotel. But the workshop hit me like a physical blow. Dad's custom tool organization system had been torn down and replaced with cheap metal shelving from a big box store. The workbench he'd built to the exact height that worked for his frame was gone, replaced by a folding table covered in Richard's power tools. They'd painted over 20 years of hand-carved molding. When I found Richard installing new cabinet hardware in the kitchen, drilling directly into Dad's custom island, I finally spoke up. "This wasn't part of the plan," I said, keeping my voice level. "Mom said you were just moving in, not renovating." Richard didn't even look up from his drill. "The place needed updating. Your dad had good intentions, but this is how people actually live now. Those built-ins took him months to create. And they made the rooms feel smaller," he replied. "We're improving the flow, increasing the property value. Your mom agrees this is better." When I asked Mom directly, her response was a masterclass in gaslighting disguised as gentle reason. "Honey, I know this is hard," she said, using the same tone she'd perfected when I was 12 and resistant to change. "But we can't live in a museum. Your father built this house for a family to enjoy, not to be preserved like some kind of shrine." She talked about moving forward, about healing, about how Dad wouldn't want us trapped by the past. When I reminded her, calmly, that she had promised him the house would be preserved, she sighed like I was being dramatic. "That was grief talking," she said. "I wasn't thinking clearly. Your father was practical. He'd want the house to serve the family that lives here now." Then she looked at me and said the part she hadn't said out loud yet. "You need to understand," she added, "this isn't really your decision anymore." That was the moment I realized I wasn't being asked to accept change. I was being pushed out of my father's legacy. 2 weeks after that conversation, Mom called and asked me to meet her for coffee. She said she had something important to discuss about our living situation moving forward. I should have seen it coming. "Richard and I have been talking," she began, stirring her coffee like she was buying time, "with the kids settled in and everyone adjusting. We think it might be better if you found your own place. You're 26 now. It's time you had some independence." She said it gently, reasonably, like she was offering advice instead of delivering an eviction notice from people who had moved into my childhood home 8 months ago. "The house is getting crowded," she continued, "and honestly, having you there is making it harder for everyone to move forward. Richard's kids need to feel like this is their home too." That was the moment it landed. I wasn't being encouraged to grow up. I was being replaced. They gave me 6 weeks to find somewhere else to live. That evening, I sat in Dad's workshop, what remained of it, trying to process what had just happened. My own mother was pushing me out so her new family could have more room to dismantle the home my father had spent 2 decades perfecting. That's when I remembered something Dad had mentioned during his final weeks, something about making sure the house was protected, about getting the paperwork right. I'd assumed he meant his will. Dad never meant just one document. I went to his filing cabinet, one of the few things Richard hadn't replaced, and started going through the estate folders. That's when I found the deed. The house wasn't in Mom's name. It wasn't in Richard's name. It was in mine. Quietly transferred 3 months before Dad died, along with a trust that covered property taxes and maintenance for the next 10 years. There were lawyer's notes, estate planning documents, and a thick folder labeled Family Security Protocol. Dad had been meticulous. Mom was granted lifetime residency rights, but only if the property was maintained according to the original homeowner specifications and intent. The renovations Richard had already made weren't just disrespectful. They were violations. For the first time since the coffee shop, something shifted. They weren't just wrong, they were out of compliance. I read for over an hour. Detailed photographs of every custom element, maintenance requirements, explicit consequences for unauthorized changes. At the bottom of the folder was a letter addressed to me, dated 2 weeks before Dad died. "If you're reading this," it began, "it means someone is trying to change what we built together. Don't let them. This house isn't just wood and stone, it's a promise. The law is on your side, but more importantly, you'll know in your heart what the right thing is." Dad hadn't just left me a house. He'd left me a plan. The next morning, I showed Mom and Richard the deed. I explained the trust requirements. I walked them through the family security protocol my father had established to protect the house. Their reaction told me everything. "That's ridiculous," Richard said immediately. "Your father couldn't have predicted how we'd need to live in this house. Those restrictions are completely unreasonable." Mom nodded along. "Honey, I know your father meant well, but we can't be trapped by rules he made before he knew what our family would look like. They didn't argue the facts, they dismissed them. They talked about legal ownership like it was a technicality, something to be worked around, not the foundation of who had the right to make decisions. "We'll contest it," Richard said flatly. "No court is going to uphold rules that stop a family from making their home comfortable." That was the moment I understood something important. They didn't believe the law applied to them. Within 2 days, Richard started making calls, not to attorneys, to relatives, to neighbors, to anyone who had known my father and might be persuaded to weigh in on what kind of son kicks his own mother out over property. He framed the story carefully. I was being unreasonable about inheritance. I was putting paperwork over people. I was dishonoring my father's memory by choosing legal rights over family unity. The calls to me started that week. Aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had strong opinions. Old family friends called to express disappointment in my selfishness. People didn't ask what the trust said. They told me what the right thing was. They were preparing an audience. By the end of the week, the pressure had shifted from private calls to public commentary. Neighbors started stopping me on the sidewalk with concerned looks and unsolicited advice. One of them mentioned that Mom had been asking for prayers. Another said Richard had described the situation as a family dispute that needed moral guidance. That's when I realized this was no longer about convincing me. They were building a narrative, one where I was the obstacle to healing, the son choosing property over people. The renovations weren't just physical anymore, they were rewriting the story in real time. And once that story solidified in the community, facts wouldn't matter unless they were revealed just as publicly. Waiting wasn't just costing my father's work, it was costing control of the truth. Meanwhile, Richard's renovations didn't slow down, they accelerated. He ripped out the built-in bookshelves in the living room and replaced them with a flat-screen TV mount. He swapped out light fixtures that required cutting into Dad's custom electrical work. Every day I waited, more of Dad's craftsmanship disappeared. Richard understood something dangerous. The more he changed, the harder it would be to restore. Every day I waited, more of my father's work vanished. That's when I called the estate attorney who had helped Dad set up the trust. His response was immediate. "You have every legal right to remove them from the property," he said. "The trust violation alone is grounds for immediate action. The unauthorized modifications have damaged the estate and violated the explicit terms of residency." He outlined the process: documentation, 30-day notice, sheriff supervision if necessary. When I hung up, the choice was clear. This wasn't a family disagreement anymore. It was an active dismantling of my father's legacy. And waiting was no longer neutral. That night, I went through every document in Dad's family security protocol folder. I'd read the first letter before, but I hadn't fully absorbed what else he'd left me. There were 3 more letters, each sealed and dated. One marked, "If modifications begin," another labeled, "If family pressure escalates." The third simply read, "Before you act." I opened the first one. "Son," it began, "if you're reading this, someone has started changing the house. I know this hurts, I know they'll have good reasons, but remember, this house isn't just wooden walls, it's a record of choices made with care. Every board I placed was a conversation with the future. Don't let them edit that conversation." The letter included instructions, calm, precise, about photographing changes, documenting damage, and understanding that preservation sometimes requires being misunderstood. "The people who want to change this house will call it improvement," Dad wrote. "You'll recognize it as erasure. Trust that instinct." I spent the next 2 hours photographing every room. Dad's before photos showed his work in exacting detail. The after photos showed what Richard had managed to dismantle in 8 months. The dining room was the hardest to look at. The bay window seat Dad had built, with hand-fitted joints and hidden storage, had been replaced by a mass-produced bench that didn't even align with the window frame. The hand-carved molding had been smothered under thick latex paint, every detail erased. In the kitchen, Richard's new cabinet hardware had left permanent scars in Dad's hand-finished island. Drill holes punched clean through wood Dad had sanded and sealed by hand. Using the valuations Dad had included, I added it up. $20,000 in custom work destroyed. But the documents went further. The trust wasn't just about ownership, it was a preservation system. Technical drawings, maintenance schedules, photographs annotated down to finished types, contact information for craftsmen in case restoration was ever needed. There were penalties for unauthorized modifications, approval requirements for any changes, and a clause I hadn't fully registered before. Residency rights are void if the property is modified in a manner inconsistent with the original homeowner's documented specifications and intent. Richard hadn't just been disrespectful. He had legally disqualified Mom from living there. The protocol read like a manual for exactly what was happening. Template legal notices, attorney contacts, even a section titled Community Pressure Response. Dad had anticipated the phone calls, the guilt, the moral framing. The guidance was blunt. Truth doesn't require consensus. The final section stopped me cold. Restoration procedures, plans for reversing common damage, sources for period-appropriate materials, craftsmen who specialized in undoing careless renovations, and a dedicated fund already set aside to pay for it. Dad hadn't just protected the house. He'd made sure it could be healed. That was the moment everything became clear. This wasn't a conversation to keep having in private. The evidence wasn't meant to persuade quietly. It was meant to end the narrative, publicly, permanently, and on record. I sat there long after midnight, surrounded by my father's handwriting, diagrams, and contingency plans, realizing something uncomfortable but undeniable. Dad hadn't trusted hope. He hadn't trusted promises, good intentions, or family loyalty under pressure. He'd trusted documentation, structure, and consequences. And in doing so, he'd given me something far more valuable than a house. He'd given me certainty. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about choosing whether my father's life's work would be preserved or erased because confrontation felt inconvenient. By the time I closed the folder, there was no question left to answer. The next step wouldn't be quiet. And it wouldn't be private. The next morning, I called the estate attorney and scheduled an emergency meeting. I brought everything: the photographs, the trust documents, the family security protocol, and Dad's letters. I laid it all out on his conference table like evidence in a court case. "This is the most comprehensive estate protection I've seen in 20 years of practice," he said after reviewing everything. "Your father essentially built a legal fortress around this property. We organized the documentation into categories: trust violations, unauthorized modifications, voided residency agreements, and financial damage to the estate. Every violation was photographed, dated, and cross-referenced with Dad's original specifications. Nothing was emotional. Everything was procedural." The attorney drafted formal notices that afternoon: a 30-day eviction notice for Mom, immediate trespass warnings for Richard and his kids once the notice period expired. Every document was witnessed, logged, and prepared for filing with the county clerk. I prepared exactly the way Dad had taught me: methodically, thoroughly, without drama. While the legal framework locked into place, the social pressure intensified. My phone didn't stop ringing. Relatives, family, friends, people who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly had urgent moral opinions. I was told I was breaking your mother's heart, that I was choosing paperwork over people, that Dad wouldn't want this. A neighbor mentioned the pastor was concerned about my spiritual state. My old high school guidance counselor suggested a mediation session, as if legal ownership and trust violations were misunderstandings that could be talked away. By Thursday, the narrative had fully formed. I was the cold son prioritizing documents over family unity. Then my cousin called. "So, everyone's coming over this weekend," she said. "Pastor Williams thinks if we all sit down together, we can help you and your mom work this out. A family intervention." That's when I understood the real risk. If I backed down publicly, the house would never be safe again. If I stood firm, I would lose more than peace. I would lose people. Friday night, I opened Dad's final letter, the one marked "Before you act." "By now," he wrote, "they'll be asking you to choose comfort over preservation. They'll call it kindness, they'll call it forgiveness, but remember this: I built this house for you to protect, not from strangers, but from the people who mean well and still get it wrong." He ended with the line that removed every doubt: "Choose the promise I made you over the peace they're asking for. Choose preservation over popularity." I understood the risk clearly. I would disappoint people I loved. I would be judged. I would stand alone. And I chose to do it anyway. I chose preserving the spirit over preserving the peace. Saturday afternoon, they came exactly as promised. 15 people gathered on my front lawn like it was an outdoor church service designed to save my soul from legal documentation. Pastor Williams stood at the center, flanked by aunts, uncles, neighbors, and family friends who genuinely believed they were intervening in a moral crisis. My high school guidance counselor was there, 3 neighbors from down the street. even Mrs. Henderson, who'd known my father since I was in elementary school. Behind them, Richard stood with his arms crossed and a satisfied expression, clearly pleased with the turnout. His kids flanked him, appropriately solemn, playing their roles as potential casualties of my cruelty. Mom stood slightly apart, tissues in hand, letting others carry the emotional burden of confronting me. They'd arranged themselves deliberately, a semicircle of moral authority facing the house my father built, ready to pronounce judgment. Pastor Williams opened the way he always did when addressing sin disguised as practicality. He spoke about family unity, forgiveness, and how legal rights couldn't heal emotional wounds. He talked about grace, about sacrifice, about choosing people over paperwork. Your father built this house for family, he said, gesturing toward the front porch. He wouldn't want it to become a source of division. One by one, others followed. An aunt said I was letting grief cloud my judgment. An uncle said I was being inflexible. Someone mentioned how disappointed my father would be if he could see this. Then Mrs. Henderson spoke. Your father was the kindest man I ever knew, she said gently. He wouldn't want his house to tear his family apart. They were using Dad's memory to justify dismantling everything he built. When Pastor Williams finally asked if I had anything to say, I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I opened the folder I'd brought. Actually, I said calmly, I'd like to read something from my father, written for this exact situation. That got their attention. I unfolded the letter labeled, If Family Pressure Escalates. If people gather to tell you that legal rights don't matter when family is involved, I read aloud, remind them that I use the law to protect my family. If they say preservation isn't loving, ask them what love means when it erases 20 years of care. The air shifted. I continued, This house is not wood and stone. It is a promise, built deliberately, maintained intentionally, and protected because I knew one day someone would try to change it for their own comfort. Mrs. Henderson took a step back. My uncle stopped nodding. A neighbor lowered his arms. Pastor Williams cleared his throat. I wasn't aware your father had left such explicit instructions. I turned the folder toward them, spreading photographs across the top page, before and after shots, hand-carved molding painted over, built-ins ripped out, custom work replaced with generic fixtures. $20,000 in handcrafted work, I said evenly, destroyed without permission, in direct violation of a trust my father created to prevent exactly this. No one interrupted. Richard tried. That's just renovation, he said, normal home improvement. But this time, no one echoed him. People leaned closer to the photographs. Someone asked where the originals had gone. Another asked why permission hadn't been requested. Mrs. Henderson stared at a photo of the bay window seat my father had built and shook her head slowly. Pastor Williams finally spoke again, quieter now. Preserving someone's legacy, when it's this intentional, that is doing the right thing. That was the moment it broke. The semicircle dissolved, people stepped back. A few apologized, not loudly, not dramatically, but sincerely. No one looked at Richard anymore. I closed the folder. I didn't ask you here to choose sides, I said. I asked you to listen to my father. He already made his choice. I looked at Mom, then at Richard. This isn't about punishment, it's about preservation. And for the first time since this started, no one argued. The legal process that followed was surprisingly quiet. Mom and Richard moved out within the 30-day notice period without appeals or courtroom battles. The sheriff's department supervised the final day, but their presence felt procedural rather than necessary. A formality marking the transition from conflict to resolution. Richard loaded his power tools and generic furniture into a moving truck. His kids gathered their belongings without argument or resentment. They looked less like victims and more like people realizing a chapter had closed. Mom packed her clothes and personal items carefully. She didn't touch Dad's furniture, not the dining table, not the workshop cabinets, not the bay window seat. On the last day, she handed me the keys and said quietly, I hope you can make peace with this decision. I already have, I replied. She nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. For the first time, she didn't argue. Legal right finally matched legal reality. The restoration began the following week. I contacted the craftsman Dad had listed in his family security protocol, starting with the areas that had suffered the most damage. The bay window seat required complete reconstruction, but Dad's measurements were precise, his photographs exhaustive. The hand-carved molding could be stripped and refinished rather than replaced. Every repair felt like a continuation of a conversation we'd never finished. Dad's notes guided each decision. His specifications ensured nothing was rushed or simplified for convenience. This wasn't about undoing someone else's mistakes. It was about honoring intentional work with intentional care. Piece by piece, the house remembered itself. 6 months later, the restoration was complete. Evening light caught the molding exactly the way Dad had planned. Books filled the rebuilt window seat again. The workshop followed his original system. Tools cleaned, aligned, respected. I invited Mrs. Henderson over for coffee. She ran her hand along the restored wood and smiled. "This is exactly how your father wanted it," she said. "You did right by him." The house wasn't a shrine, it wasn't frozen in time. It was alive again, a place where craftsmanship, memory, and purpose coexisted. I didn't evict my family out of anger. I reclaimed my home out of responsibility. Sometimes doing the right thing means choosing a promise over comfort, and sometimes preserving the spirit matters more than preserving the peace.